Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Let's welcome our first guest. A real pleasure to welcome him back. It's been a while since he last joined us. He's a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and the co-founder of Reaganomics. Now, check him out at paulcraigroberts.org. That's his website. He's a prolific writer, terrific articles, great insight into what's going on geopolitically right now. As it happens, updates every couple of hours. Check out paulcraigroberts.org. You can regularly see him on TV, on RT and Press TV and elsewhere. And Mr. Roberts, by the way, happy Thanksgiving and thanks for stepping away from the turkey to talk to us today. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. I'm pleased to speak with you again, Richie.
Paul, thanks very much. Just before we talk about the downing of the Russian plane, let's talk about what you will probably be getting now on your mainstream news channels there in the US, and that is that it's looking very like David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, is going to secure enough votes from the British Parliament to join the bombing spree in Syria. You will probably be aware that he addressed Parliament today, laying out the reasons why he thinks it's a good idea to get involved. The leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, asked some pretty fair, I wouldn't say tough, but fair questions to Cameron about what would happen afterwards. And later on today then, Corbyn wrote to his Labour colleagues, his Labour MPs, and said that he couldn't, in any conscience, vote in favour of the bombing. But it looks like no matter what, David Cameron is going to get those votes next week, Paul, to join in the bombing spree. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Richie, I haven't paid any attention to it. Which side is Cameron bombing on, Washington's or the French and the Russian side?
Well, going with the United States, the French and the Turks, apparently.
Well, my understanding was the French wanted to join up with the Russians and bomb ISIS.
Isn't that interesting? Because as you and I talk, sorry to interrupt you, as you and I talk, yes, it was announced late this afternoon that Russian officials are in Paris this afternoon talking to the French about a strategy going forward. That is very interesting.
Well, it looks like there would be two different coalitions if the French go along with the Russians and vice versa, and they're bombing ISIS. But Washington has been, until the Paris attacks, very protective of ISIS. Indeed, it's a Washington creation. Washington created it. This has been admitted on television by the former director of the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, who says flat out, yes, we created ISIS. So it's kind of hard in Washington, of course, is using ISIS to try to overthrow Assad. So it's hard to see how Washington's agenda can coincide with Russia's. And it's hard to see how France's agenda, if they actually believe ISIS was responsible for the Paris attacks, it's hard to see how France could go along with Washington. And so we see here some potential breakup in NATO, which would be a good thing. We also see strains on NATO from the Turkish, shooting down the Russian military plane and lying about it and not giving a believable explanation, and being reprimanded by the Vice Chancellor of Germany, who stated publicly that the unstable element was not Putin, it was the president of Turkey. And we've seen a lot of distancing of other NATO countries from Turkey, making it clear they have no intention of going to war with Russia in order to defend Turkey's right to shoot down a plane and lie about it. So I think these are all stresses on NATO. It must worry Washington a great deal. And of course, the British Prime Minister for the longest time has been a Washington stooge. He answers to Washington. He doesn't answer to the British people. So I'm not surprised that Cameron would desert the French and line up Washington. That's just normal behavior for the British. They always line up with Washington.
Let me ask you this. You talked about the Turks shooting down that Russian plane. Did they do that of their own volition, Paul, or were they encouraged to do it from outside of Turkey?
You know, we don't know at this time. There are three explanations. I can tell you what they are. The neoconservative explanation, for example, being laid down by my former newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, is that, see, this proves that Putin is a paper tiger. Even Turkey can shoot down a Russian plane. He doesn't do anything about it. And so the Europeans don't have to worry about sending troops to Ukraine. He's not going to do anything about it. We can put more bases on his border. He's not going to do anything about it. This is the neocons are using this to claim that, see, Putin just accepted he's weak. He can't do anything. And so we can go ahead and push harder. So the neoconservatives are using it to try to build up more aggression from NATO toward Russia. That's one explanation. And of course, that's whether they were involved in it, I don't know, but Victoria Nuland, I think, was recently in Turkey. And she's the one who stirs up a lot of this stuff. So another explanation is that, the Turkish president is just another gangster, some billionaire oligarch. And the Turks were buying all of the oil from ISIS. And it was a very profitable business for them. And the money was flowing into the president of Turkey's pocket or that of his family, his son. And he got very angry that the Russians busted that up. You know, the Russians blew up a large number of the oil tankers that were lined up with the oil to go into Turkey. And so his huge fortune is impacted by this. And so one explanation is that he simply lost it. He lost control. He's not a guy who is very much in control. He's not, deliberative. And that he decided that he was protected by NATO and that Russia wouldn't do anything because Turkey could invoke Article 5 of NATO and present Russia with all of the European countries, the United States. And so that's the second explanation. The third explanation is given to me by a former Air Force intelligence officer, and he says that there's another possible explanation. Apparently, the Russians have a new kind of technology that allows them to shut down all of our communication systems. My friend, the Air Force intelligence officer, says that when the Russians first went into Syria, they announced what their area of air operations was and informed everybody to stay out of it. And an hour before the first sortie that they launched, they gave notice to the Americans and Israelis. And as the sortie began, they used this technology and shut down the entire communication systems of the United States and Israel in the area. Everything went blind, even the satellites. And this has terrified the Americans. Because it means they would have no control over any battle, whether air, sea, or land.
And it comes as well, Paul. It comes at a time when...
Wait, let me finish this.
Sorry, go ahead.
And then, according to my friend, they used it one other occasion, maybe a week later. The two Israeli American jets, F-15s or 16s, flew into the area that the Russians had told everybody to stay out of. And the Russians informed them that they were in this prescribed area, and the Israelis didn't respond. And the Russians used this technology a second time and shut down all the fire control systems, all the communication systems of the Israeli planes. Left them totally blind. They couldn't even talk to each other. They couldn't reach their base. Their operational weapon systems wouldn't work. And then the Russians reached them over just the AM system that the civilian pilots use, and told them, okay, get out now. And they turned tail and fled, and they haven't been back. Well, this, my friend says, this has the Americans beside themselves. They've sent every resource they have in Air Force intelligence, code breakers, all of that, to Syria, and they're hoping that the Turks, having shot down the plane, will encourage the Russians to use this technology much more often. And the more often it's used, the more they can monitor it, look for its weaknesses, or look for how to break the code or duplicate it. And so that's a third reason that he says that this was, he doesn't know this, but he says this is one of the reasons that this is what would explain why the United States and Turkey would take such an extreme risk at shooting down a Russian military aircraft over Syria.
Is he reliable, Paul? Is he the sort of guy that when he comes up with this sort of intelligence, is it usually right?
Well, he's reliable in the sense that he's experienced and highly intelligent. And he's not saying that he knows this.
Yeah, he's just heard it.
That he's saying this, he just knows from his own experience that this means, we are like a banana republic right now, facing Genghis Khan or something, you see, because we have no protection against this. So it means if we tried to go into combat, they can shut down our Navy, they can shut down our Air Force, they can shut down our armies, and we've got nothing to do about it. And so this leaves us helpless. I had heard myself earlier that the Russians had used this technology on the missile cruiser that we had sent to set off their Black Sea port in Crimea. And they had one plane fly over and the whole ship's shut down. The
ship went black, is that right? It went into complete silence, radio silence.
And it scared the crew to death. And so they have this ability to make everything a total sitting duck. And so I think his explanation makes a hell of a lot of sense. I mean, if this I don't know they use this technology, but there have been these reports. I've seen them. You don't know if they're right or wrong, and the Western media is so useless, they won't investigate. You can't trust the Western media anymore. In fact, they won't even report it because they don't want anybody to know that we're not number one or something, you see. So it's hard to really know, but that makes a lot of sense to me as well. I had a lot to do for a while with security matters, and I can see that this would be a fundamental challenge. It would, you would feel like you had bows and arrows against people with nuclear weapons.
You must mention, Paul, I must mention what Paul said there. Paul's been a bit modest. This isn't a conspiracy theorist making the claims. This is Paul Craig Roberts, folks. He's a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He's a remarkable journalist, accredited journalist, and these are scary times. And if Russia is in possession of a weapon like that, because it is a weapon, let's be honest about it, a jamming weapon that's so good is that it can wipe out, even technically advanced countries like the United States and Britain. Well, they'd have very good reason to be scared of that, so they would. It's 24 minutes to the top of the hour. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. richie@richieallen.co.uk is the email address. Paul, where's all this going to end, Paul? We've seen this every 10 years or so. We claim a dictator has gone bad. He's going after his own people. We go in there. There's a complete mess. Weapons get into the hands of jihadists. They go killing civilian populations. It's absolute mayhem. Now, I've got very strong opinions that much of this is deliberate. It's not because of any bad planning. But it seems to be getting more and more serious. People who've been on this program in recent weeks are saying things like there's a deliberate agenda to push us towards either the brink of a devastating global conflict, Paul, or actually there's an agenda to go beyond the brink and actually get us into a serious conflict with Russia and China. Where are you on that?
Well, Richie, the agenda has been clear since, I think, about 1992, when Paul Wolfowitz in the Pentagon wrote the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The Wolfowitz Doctrine says that now that the United States is a unipower, our policy is to make certain that we remain that. And therefore, our principal goal is to prevent the rise of any other country that could in any way limit the ability of the United States to act unilaterally anywhere in the world. And so while the neocons were busy with all their wars in the Middle East, Putin was able to restore Russia and its military capability and apparently come up with some amazing new weapons. And all of a sudden, the neocons found that the puppet Yeltsin government was gone, and there was a government there with an independent foreign policy, which the Wolfowitz Doctrine does not permit. And so they said, what can we so that's why the emphasis quickly shifted from the Middle East to Ukraine. We quickly organized a coup in Ukraine, trying to destabilize Russia, present them with problems. We intended to grab Crimea and the Black Sea Naval Base and cut them off from a warm water port and put NATO into Ukraine. Well, it didn't work out. We mishandled it. We pulled off the coup. We got our puppets in, but they weren't able to hold on to what we were really after. So now, if you will remember the UN 70th anniversary speeches at the end of September, where Putin stated explicitly, clearly, that Russia can no longer tolerate the state of affairs in the world. He was talking about us. 2 days later, he's in Syria, he's taken over the thing. And ISIS is being decimated.
How bad has ISIS been decimated, Paul, by Russia's 6-week bombing campaign there? What are you hearing? We're hearing figures like he's really devastated them. He's knocked them out by 40, 50%. What is it?
All their supply depots are gone. They've lost a lot of territory because the Russian air support of the Syrian army, the Syrians have pushed them out, and they've lost their money because the Russian air attack has destroyed the transport of their oil to Turkey, where the Turkish president's family was buying it all. So they're heavily damaged, and the Syrian troops their morale is way up because they've now got air cover, and because Putin has told the Americans and Israeli to stay out of his area, which they will certainly do.
Especially if he's got that weapon, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that that's a huge disturbing factor because part of the neoconservative, see, the whole reason for the Middle Eastern wars is that the neoconservatives wanted to get rid of states with independent foreign policies. Who had an independent policy? Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Iran had an independent policy, and Assad in Syria.
Isn't it true too, Paul? Sorry to interrupt you. Isn't it true too that those countries you just named there, they also had independent fiduciary policies? They basically were in control of their own banks. Isn't that right?
Yeah, but it's mainly they were independent countries, and they could block to some extent unilateral action by Washington. And so we concocted all these lies about them as excuses. This is the neoconservatives implementing their agenda of American world hegemony. That's what this is. That agenda does serve the oil companies. It serves the military security complex. It serves the Israel lobby. It serves all these people, but it's an ideological agenda of the neoconservatives who say that the United States is an indispensable country. It's the end of history. We are history's choice. Everybody has to be what we are, do as we say. and anybody who dissents from that is gone and over with. So that was the reason for these particular countries were attacked. There are a lot of dictators. In fact, there are worse dictators in the Middle East, and they're all our allies. I mean, the Saudis.
Oh, the Saudis. You could be here all night talking about the Saudis, yeah.
Yeah, Bahrain, all of those places. Egypt has a military dictatorship, but we don't care about those dictators. And, of course, they're Muslims, too. But we only cared about the ones who really aren't that much dictators. I mean, Assad is elected. The Iranian government is elected. They're not dictators.
Paul, sorry to interrupt you, Paul, have you got sympathy? We've only got about 6 or 7 minutes left. We won't keep you from the turkey too much longer. And I don't joke when I say that. I really appreciate you coming on Thanksgiving. And mea culpa, my apologies again for emailing you early this morning about the Thanksgiving. No, there's not. And you did say that in your email to me today, Paul. And no, but I mean that. It's still a holiday. And you're a Trojan. You work like an absolute horse. You've got to be Irish, I think. You work like an Irishman. You spend a lot of time at this. And today is a holiday. So I do appreciate that. It's 16 minutes to the top of the hour. We've got Paul for another probably 10 minutes max, and that's it then. Paul, I'm of the belief, I'm not anywhere near as experienced as you, and I'm of the belief that while you're right, that we can trace this ideology back to Leo Strauss and William Christall Sr., and, you know, there's some wonderful films have been made about Straussian series that led to neoconservatism, and while at the same time Said Qutb in Egypt, while radical Islam was kind of forming through him. It's a wonderful period of history to study, actually. And you're 100% right. I think it's more sinister, Paul. And I think that all of this is planned out. When we see all these millions of Syrian refugees fleeing the country, and we saw it with Libyans, and they go into Europe, Paul, and they overwhelm countries in Europe. They overwhelm their essential services, healthcare, and all of that. I think it's deliberate, Paul. I think it really is. That all of those consequences are planned. And I'm not sure you agree with me, but I just got to put that point out there because some of our listeners will think that as well. Have you any thoughts on that?
No, I don't think that's the case, because that implies something even more omniscient than the James Bondian specter.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't have this type of power or mental capability or organizing capability, or for it to exist through centuries and all. What we have is the Soviets collapsed. The neocons say, history chose us. They didn't choose the workers, not the proletariat. They chose the American capitalists. It means we rule. We're it. We're the hegemon. And that ideology has come into play. It allies with Israel, who wants to get rid of people in its way in the Middle East. It allies with the military security complex. Their budgets go up. The CIA's power goes up. It allies with the oil companies. And so it works for a lot of powerful interest groups that have different agendas, but they all work under the neocon American hegemony. It works for the bankers as well. So it's really something that everybody all these powerful interest groups can benefit from this neocon ideology.
Now, I totally respect your opinion, and you might be right. I completely respect that. But I'm going to make this point, and then I'm going to shut up. And the point I would make is, yet those very consequences I described, Paul, they're happening anyway.
Well, look, Richie, I can tell you this, nobody expected the Soviet Union to collapse. This caught everybody off guard. It caught the CIA totally off guard. I remember I went in, they asked me to come in to talk to them. It caught the Russians off guard. It happened because the right-wing communists arrested Gorbachev, the president. You know, everybody's forgotten that. They pretend, Reagan did this. Reagan had nothing to do with it. Reagan wasn't even there anymore.
Yeah.
He wasn't even the president anymore. The Soviet collapse was totally unexpected. And that's what set all this in motion. Nobody caused that. It was an accident. The right-wing commies thought that Gorbachev was endangering Soviet power by releasing the Eastern European satellites and by permitting the unification of Germany. They were opposed to the policy. They thought this was too much weakness and it would come back and bite. And it has. They were right. It has come back and bite.
It has, yeah. But didn't we flood the Soviet Union as it was then? Didn't we flood it with billions and billions of cheap dollars? And didn't that ultimately raise inflation to crazy levels there?
No. This happened because the Soviet government turned on itself and destroyed itself. When they arrested the president of Russia, the person formerly known as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, this destroyed the party's control. And that's when all the dissolution began. That's when Yeltsin stepped to the fore and took over. And he was a drunkard and ended up a puppet of Washington. So the Russians were in collapse all of the 90s and into about, when did Putin come in? I'm trying to remember. 2005?
Yeah, I was going to say about 9 years ago, 9 or 10 years ago.
5 or 6.
Yeah.
And by then, Washington was used to Russia being a puppet of America, like Yeltsin. And this Putin fellow was supposed to be a protege of Yeltsin. So they thought they still had it under control, and they got busy in the Middle East, where nothing worked for them. Nothing that they thought would happen happened. And you see, the European governments, when they enabled American wars in the Middle East, they didn't think that the consequence was going to be refugees. You would have thought any British prime minister, any French president, any German chancellor would have said, now, wait a minute, we're going to go over there and destroy all this and create all these displaced people. Where are they going to go? They're going to come here. But none of them have enough sense to do that. It was completely obvious. Even I could see that. But none of the European leaders, or else they were afraid to get in America's way. I mean, most of them are bought and paid for. You know, most of the European politicians are on the American payroll.
That's right, including my government in Ireland,
And most of the journalists are as well. You know, that German Udo, what's his name? That German editor who wrote the book, he said there wasn't a significant European journalist that wasn't on the CIA's payroll.
That's right. I can't remember the guy's surname. I know who you're talking about. In fact, he's been invited on this program. Yes, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, that's right.
So I think that Washington thought it had everything under control, and the Europeans weren't paying any attention to the consequences of their blind support for Washington's wars. And that's how the refugees came. It wasn't something somebody planned. In fact, you know, Washington's original plan was to invade Syria with its own army. Don't you remember all the stuff about the Assad has crossed?
That's right. Yeah. I remember Wesley Clark's famous comments on that. Yeah.
Said, no, you're not going to do that. They just told us no, and we weren't prepared to do it.
Paul, where's this all going to end? We've got about 3 minutes, which isn't much time before we got to finish up this there. Where's all this going to end, Paul? What's the likely outcome of all of this?
Richie, who knows where it's going to end? I think one thing it could do, it could actually end in peace if it puts so much pressure on NATO relations that they break up. Because without the cover of NATO, Washington can't push its hegemonic agenda. Without Europe in its pocket and the bases, and without the cover that all the European politicians give Washington, you know, a coalition of the willing, a NATO action, all that covers up Washington's war crimes. So if NATO breaks up, which it could do, look, already the NATO is shaking his boots because this idiot in Turkey shot down a Russian plane. They don't want to be blown up by the Russians to defend Turkey. Washington is already worried about NATO falling apart. If you get the British going one way and the French another, that's going to be more stress and strain. The Eastern European countries, some of them, like the Czechs, the Hungarians, they're beginning to wonder, what in the hell did we get into NATO for? Why did we get into Europe? So you could see the whole thing come apart because of the Turkish incident, because of the incompetence of Washington. I mean, these people are arrogant. They're full of hubris. They don't have any sense. They're just used to using power and bully and threats and coercion and money. And they're up against Putin, who's got far more sense than they do. And apparently better weapons. So this whole thing could just end with the breakup of NATO, the breakup of the EU. And then this means the American neoconservatives haven't got any cavalry. They haven't got any mercenaries. They can't hide behind NATO. So the whole effort to exercise unilateral action over the world ends. And we see the same sort of thing in China, because China is standing up to us. China's not putting up with our provocations. And so we could see the end of the American era of bullying the rest of the world and purchasing the rest of the world. This could be the end of this. It could have a very happy outcome. I don't think Putin is going to take it to war.
Paul, I hope you're right. Folks, get on to paulcraigroberts.org. That's where you can read more from Paul. Paul, thanks for doing this today of all days. Enjoy the rest of the day with your family, my friend, and we'll catch up with you again sometime in the new year. Look after yourself, Paul.
Well, I look forward to talking to you again, Richie. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure, Paul. Thanks a lot. Bye. Great to hear from you. Paul Craig Roberts on the line to us there from his home in Chicago.